The room was closed to everyone except senior leadership, yet the new VP walked in with the confidence of someone who believed attitude could replace understanding. He scrolled through a spreadsheet, paused at my line, and asked why the company was paying me so much. He did not whisper it. He did not soften it. He delivered it with a tone meant to provoke. Several executives shifted in their seats. Others stared at the table. It was the kind of silence that reveals far more than words. I watched him introduce himself through confrontation and realized he had not taken a single moment to review the history of the systems he now claimed to supervise. I explained calmly what my role covered, how the infrastructure had been built, and why continuity mattered more than appearances. He listened with a patient smile, the kind used by people who have already decided the outcome before the discussion even begins. He turned to the team and asked if my responsibilities could be redistributed. A few nodded quickly, eager to appear flexible. The conversation moved fast, as if strategy could be adjusted without consequence. I noticed that no one acknowledged the long record of crises prevented or the years of operational consistency. They wanted savings, not stability. The decision to restructure was confirmed within minutes. It sounded efficient. It looked decisive. It ignored everything that holds a large organization together. I remained quiet, knowing emotion would only entertain them. Before the meeting ended, I offered one reminder with complete clarity. There was a clause in my contract that required careful reading. I mentioned it once. No one asked a single question. The changes did not arrive with announcements or explanations. They appeared quietly in updated charts and revised access lists. My authority over critical systems was reassigned to people who had never managed a crisis. Folders I had protected for years suddenly required requests I no longer had the right to approve. There was no mention of performance. Only a message about cost optimization gently placed at the end of an email, as if trimming experience were a harmless administrative adjustment. I watched responsibilities I had shaped over a decade handed to individuals who believed familiarity could be learned in a week. Institutional memory was treated like an outdated document rather than a body of knowledge earned through failures avoided and disasters contained. The VP walked through the office with the confidence of someone convinced that efficiency meant removing the people who understood the foundations of the system. Legal was copied on every update. They never replied. Not a question. Not a request for clarification. Just silence that signaled how little attention was being given to decisions that carried long-term consequences. I realized how many signatures were being added by people who had not taken the time to read what they were approving. As access disappeared, small irregularities began to show. Reports were delayed. Timelines slipped. Teams hesitated because they sensed something essential had been removed from the structure. No one wanted to admit it, especially not the people who encouraged the changes. I said nothing. I knew interference would be interpreted as resistance. I simply observed the speed at which decisions were made and the confidence with which they were justified. When speed replaces understanding, risk accelerates. The clause had been created long before the new leadership arrived. It was written after a severe incident that nearly cost the company a major contract. At the time, the board wanted protection. They asked me to design a system that would prevent reckless interference from destabilizing critical operations. I delivered exactly what they requested. The clause was simple. If my responsibilities were altered without a structured transition, certain authorizations would deactivate automatically. It was not punishment. It was protection for the organization and for its partners. When the first changes to my role appeared, I explained the clause again. I used clear language, the same language the board had approved years earlier. I reminded them that the system did not rely on personal judgment. It followed parameters. Once those parameters were breached, safeguards would activate on their own. I received polite acknowledgments that carried no real attention. The VP smiled as if I were reciting history rather than describing a living part of the company's security framework. I repeated the explanation during a follow-up meeting, once more in a calm tone. I did not raise my voice. I did not warn them. I offered information and assumed responsible people would take the time to read what governed their decisions. Legal was present during the briefing. They took notes. None of those notes translated into action. As restructuring accelerated, I observed how confidence often grows in the absence of understanding. They believed the clause was symbolic. They believed systems would adapt to their direction simply because they wished it so. I chose not to argue. I allowed the silence to stand on its own. Silence is often mistaken for compliance. I submitted my resignation in a brief message addressed to the executive office. No emotion. No explanation beyond what policy required. It was timed with precision, not out of anger, but to ensure the transition aligned with the internal safeguards they had ignored. I knew that resigning would activate consequences more efficiently than any legal action. Lawsuits create noise. Structured clauses create results. My departure was not a performance. It was an administrative event with a chain of reactions already defined years earlier. When the news reached leadership, the response arrived faster than expected. They accepted my resignation within minutes. There was no negotiation, no request for reconsideration. The VP replied with a short message that carried an almost visible sense of relief. It confirmed what I had observed for weeks. They believed removing experience solved a budget concern. They never paused to consider what experience protected. I collected my belongings quietly and notified the teams who relied on my work that the transition would proceed according to policy. I did not offer commentary. I simply followed the procedure they had approved without reading. People congratulated the VP for moving swiftly. He walked through the office with a satisfied expression, convinced that decisive leadership was the sign of modern efficiency. As I left the building, no one realized that several systems had already entered a protective state triggered by the structural changes made before my departure. Nothing dramatic, nothing visible, just the beginning of a controlled sequence they had unknowingly initiated. The executives saw my resignation as the removal of an expense. They thought the cost problem had just left the building. The first alerts appeared just after midnight. At that hour, only automated systems should have been active. Instead, a sequence of silent warnings began to surface across the internal network. Dependencies that had always operated seamlessly began to fail one after another. Nothing catastrophic at first. Small delays, missed synchronizations, queued tasks that never completed. By morning, those small delays would become operational barriers, but during the night they had the quiet intensity of a fuse burning towards something larger. Regulatory reporting paused automatically. The system could not validate the required approvals because the individuals now listed as responsible had never been granted the critical signatures that lived inside the old structure. The safeguards did not ask questions. They simply halted activity to prevent inaccurate filings. Partner access began to lock itself. External portals that had depended on my authorization keys registered their absence and moved into protection mode. Each change followed rules created long before the VP arrived. There was no interference, no manipulation, nothing altered by human hands. Everything unfolding was the result of a design approved during a more careful era of leadership. The automated logs captured each event with perfect clarity and recorded the exact moment the internal structure no longer met the requirements the board had once insisted upon. By 2 a.m, legal teams were forwarding messages to one another, trying to understand why functions that had operated flawlessly for years were suddenly shutting down. They searched for errors, but the system offered none. It was not broken. It was responding. The architecture did not behave emotionally. It behaved according to the rules they ignored. The system behaved exactly as written. The morning began with a stream of calls that grew faster than anyone could answer. Market analysts noticed irregularities in the company's filings before leadership understood what the systems had already done overnight. By the time executives arrived at their offices, the first market reaction had begun. Shares dipped sharply, then continued downward as automated alerts reached institutional investors who depended on consistent reporting. Confidence does not decline slowly. It drops in steps that feel like sudden falls. Partners suspended operations as soon as their access failed. They could not afford to proceed without validated approvals from the correct internal authorities. Each suspension carried financial implications, and the delays compounded every hour. A major international transaction, scheduled for that morning, froze without warning. Banks involved in the process demanded explanations the executives could not provide. The pause triggered penalties that had been negotiated years earlier. Numbers escalated with unnerving speed. What began as a technical interruption advanced into a financial rupture. Executives gathered in a conference room surrounded by screens displaying losses in real time. They asked for updates. They asked for solutions. They asked why safeguards they had casually dismissed were now dictating market reactions. I did not reveal the full figure immediately. I allowed them to understand the sequence first, the chain of decisions that brought them to this moment. Only when they realized each event connected to the restructuring did I share the final calculation. The loss had passed the 1 billion mark before noon. No meeting could reverse the activation. No statement could calm the partners. They finally understood the scale of what they had triggered. Restructuring saved millions. The clause cost billions. The first call came from the VP. His voice, once confident, carried a tremor he tried to hide. He asked for conversation, insisting the situation was not as serious as it looked. I listened without interrupting, then reminded him that every safeguard had been documented in meetings he chose not to attend. He attempted to shift the tone toward cooperation, but the time for adjustments had passed. The system was already following its established sequence. A few minutes later, legal contacted me. Their approach was measured, controlled, and filled with carefully chosen phrases. They asked whether I would consider a temporary advisory role to ease the disruption. I explained that advisory positions require structure, not improvisation. The clause did not pause for negotiation. It activated when the internal architecture changed, and it would continue until the company restored what had been removed. They understood, but understanding did not offer them relief. The final call came from a member of the board. His message was direct. He wanted to know whether the damage could still be contained. I explained the mechanics again, clearly and calmly. This was not retaliation. This was the exact outcome of policies created after the crisis they had nearly forgotten. I reminded him that resignation activates consequences far faster than litigation. He remained silent for several seconds, absorbing the reality that had been outlined for years, yet never respected. I declined all requests to return. Not out of anger, out of structure. The company had chosen speed over comprehension, and the safeguards responded as they were designed to do. The calls continued throughout the day, but the answers never changed. Respect arrives late when experience leaves early. If you are watching this and you are over 50, let me speak to you without interruption. You already know that experience is rarely appreciated in the moment it is offered. People who have not lived through pressure believe knowledge appears instantly. They mistake confidence for competence and assume systems remain stable no matter who manages them. You and I understand something different. Experience is not expensive. Ignorance is. You do not need to defend your value with emotional arguments. Structure does that for you when it is built with clarity. When a workplace attempts to shrink your responsibilities without understanding what they rest upon, allow the consequences to reveal the truth. You do not need to raise your voice. You do not need to justify your history to people who confuse reading a document with understanding its implications. Never rush to be understood by individuals who have not taken the time to learn what came before them. Patience is not weakness at this stage of life. It is strategy. It allows reality to surface without you forcing it. It allows those who underestimate you to walk directly into the limits they refuse to acknowledge. Remember this as you move through the later years of your career. Wisdom is not loud. It is consistent. It carries weight even when others dismiss it. And when the moment arrives, clarity has a way of revealing who built the foundation and who merely occupied the space above it. People who call experience too expensive eventually receive the invoice.